Welcome to the 2022 Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum Summer Seminar Series. I am Susan Sprake, the 2022 President of the Forum. John Ambrosiano is a retired physicist who worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory from 1997 until his retirement in 2019. In 2003, having become curious about Buddhism, he visited several centers in the Santa Fe area, including one in Los Alamos, guided by Henry Finney, an artist and Zen teacher affiliated with Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. In Santa Fe, he met Buddhist teacher and author Matthew Flickstein and became his student in 2008. A few years later, he began training as a teacher himself and has been teaching Buddhism and meditation at the Unitarian Church since that time. The group, called the Los Alamos Dharma Friends, meet online and at UULA Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings. Please join me in welcoming John Ambrosiano.
And thank you, Susan, for that kind introduction. So, intriguing title. What do we mean by the science of Buddhism? I think, I hope that with what I put together for you tonight, you'll sort of see where that idea comes from. It's really natural if you allow a certain kind of evidence that isn't typically allowed in science, that evidence that comes from introspection. Which is where most of the contributions of Buddhism and wisdom traditions at its root obtain their insights. So we'll talk about that. So here's the thread of the talk. We're going to give what may not be a brief introduction to Buddhism, but that's because there's a lot there that we want to draw on. Then we'll transition to Buddhist philosophy, which shares at its core the same inspiration as other wisdom traditions around the world, including those are Christian mystics, Muslim mystics, and Jewish mystics. Then we'll talk about Buddhist psychology. Buddhism is, interestingly enough, a very strong source of wisdom in psychology, because its meditators, its practitioners, have delved into the working of the mind for thousands of years. And then we'll talk about recent parallels have been drawn between Buddhism and modern physics. So, as Susan mentioned, Buddhism is considered one of the four great religions. But if you start peeling back the layers, you find that it doesn't look like a religion in some respects. What I would call Buddhism is non-theistic. I'll explain what that is. A blend of religious tradition. It does have rites and rituals. Spirituality, which it shares with all the world's wisdom traditions, and Eastern philosophy, as well as a large body of empirical knowledge about psychology. So the roots of Buddhism are in the Vedic traditions of India. Those go back about 4,000 years. The sages of the Vedic tradition used the only instruments that were available to them to understand their own mind. Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay. I wasn't sure. So the sages of ancient India relied on their ability to concentrate and to keenly observe their inner experience, as well as their perceptions of the outer world. And that's where many of the the basics of Buddhist traditions come from the Vedas. The kind of meditation that Buddhists do is based on those same yogic traditions that come from Hindu culture. And the contribution that the Buddha made was to take these tools that he inherited from his own culture and to apply them to a very difficult problem, the problem of the human condition and the source of suffering. Why do people suffer? Or why do they feel they suffer? So the sages of ancient India, looking into their own minds and into their experience, discovered that there's a deeper reality, that the world that we see is perceptually is essentially an illusion. And beneath that illusion is a deeper reality in which there are no barriers, there's no separation between anything. There is one underlying reality, all inclusive. And the Hindus gave that underlying reality several names. They called it Brahman. They called it self. Notice there's a capital S. So we're trying to distinguish between what's called the small self and the big self. So when you see passages in the Hindu tradition that talk about the self, they're usually capitalized. That tells us that we're talking about the ultimate reality, not just our personal reality. So they called it the self, they called it consciousness, or they simply called it that. In a common saying in the Advaita tradition, which is a Hindu tradition that literally translates to not to, they are fond of saying that I am that, you are that, and that is all there is. So this is a passage from the Upanishads, and it goes like this. This is very small and hard to read. It says, as the same fire assumes different shapes when it consumes objects differing in shape, so does the one self take the shape of every creature in whom he is present. As the same air assumes different shapes when it enters objects differing in shape, so does the one self take the shape of every creature in whom he is present. And as the sun, who is the eye of the world, cannot be tainted by the defects in our eyes or by the objects it looks upon, so the one self, dwelling in all, cannot be tainted by the evils of the world, for this self transcends all. So this is the essence of these wisdom traditions, this mystical tradition. The idea that there is one reality and we are that one. We are not a part of that reality. We are that reality. The analogies that are used are like waves on the ocean. The waves think that they are waves, but they're never anything other than the ocean. This passage from the Upanishads reflects that understanding. So in telling you about Buddhism, I have to tell you about the Buddha because it's a remarkable story. The Buddha started life as an Indian prince. He was born Siddhartha Gautama about 2,500 years ago now, in India. And his father, in line with tradition, brought a soothsayer into the palace and said, here's my son, tell me how great he's going to be. Tell me all about my son. And he said, well, your son is either going to be a great king, which sounded terrific, or he's going to be a wandering spiritual teacher, which the father didn't like much at all. So his response to that was to shelter young Siddhartha. So Siddhartha lived a noble life. He was trained in the arts of nobility and kingship. He was sheltered from any sort of harsh reality. And he was a good person. I mean, he wasn't a spoiled child by any means. He could have easily been. But there are many stories about how kind he was. He had a cousin who liked to shoot things, and he had his arrow pointed at a swan, and Buddha came up, or then to be Buddha. Siddhartha comes along and says, "Don't shoot the swan. You know, it's a perfectly good swan." And so there are stories like that about Buddha and his nobility as a person. Of course, you can't shelter anyone from anything for very long. And so, as the story goes, Buddha eventually persuaded his father to let him out in the world. And his father said, "Sure, I'm not keeping you." And he sent him out into the world on at least 3 occasions with his charioteer as a chaperone. And so on one occasion, he sees someone who's ill, very ill. Stories say that they had plague, and he went up to cradle the person who was so touched by his plight. And this charioteer says, "Don't touch him unless you want to be sick too." On another occasion, he went out and he saw an old person walking only with the aid of a cane. And he said, "What's this?" And he says, "It's an old man, an old person. We will all become old. It's going to happen to all of us." And on the last of these occasions, as the story goes, he goes out into the world and he sees a body on a plank on its way to being burned. And he lingers long enough to see it actually being burned. He says, "What's going on here? What is happening? This person is not moving, engulfed in flames." So this is where I find it a little hard to believe the legends. It's hard for me to believe that the Buddha never encountered death. But the purpose of this story is to illustrate how the Buddha became involved, devoted to the problem of human suffering. Why do people suffer as they do? And is there anything that can be done about it? So the Buddha mulled this over for some time. He had lived happily in the palace. He had a young wife and had just had a baby. And he agonized over over this situation. Eventually, he felt he just had to go. He felt he had important work to do. So this was called his renunciation. He went out into the world. He cut his hair, and he became a wandering monk called, I think they're called sadhus in India. And so he became Siddhartha the ascetic. And Siddhartha the ascetic studied with the best of masters that he could find. So he studied with 2 of them. And at the time, meditation was a way of really delving into the roots of human consciousness. It was possible through concentration to create an atmosphere in the mind that's progressively quieter and quieter, freer and freer thoughts and other distractions. And what's left is not nothing. What's left is the base of consciousness, the root of consciousness. You are awake, you are aware, but not of anything. And this was essentially the state of the art at the time the Buddha began his practice. Well, according to the legend, of course, they would put it this way: he surpassed all of his teachers that he learned concentration from, and he wasn't satisfied because he felt there was something about human suffering that could be alleviated. Not all of it, perhaps, but there was something that could be done. So he said goodbye to his teachers. His teachers wanted him to take over. They were getting older. No, you're going to take over my thing here. And he said, no, I have to go. And so he began a life. He eventually ran into 4 other sadhus, and they became his companions, or 5 other sadhus who became his companions. And together they explored very harsh ascetic practices. Things like trying to live on 1 grain of rice a day. That's how the story goes. I know I can't live on 1 grain a day, but I'm not the Buddha. So this was serious business. This was really putting your entire life into the search for a solution to life's mysteries. And it got him into trouble. So this statue is pretty famous, and there are others like it, called the Starving Buddha, typically. And they show a very emaciated Buddha, hollowed eyes, nothing but skin and bones. And this nearly finished him. He was willing to go this far, but fortunately, as he was sitting at the base of a tree one day near a riverbank, a young woman came along. She was from an aristocratic family. She thought she was going to put a bowl of rice porridge at the foot of a tree in honor of the river god. And then there was this starving mendicant sitting there. And she went, oh my God, is that the river god? No, he looks terrible. So she went to him and she offered the porridge. And at first he was reluctant, and she convinced him to do it. And as he was beginning to eat the porridge, as the story goes, and she remained with him, on the river, there was a boat passing. And in the boat was a musician and his pupil. And the musician was saying to the pupil, he said, the pupil supposedly had an instrument that he was tuning. He said, if you tighten the string too much, it will snap. And if you leave it too slack, it won't play. And that insight, the Buddha had an insight at that point into something that we call the middle way, which was one of the first things he taught in his first sermon, which in application to what he was searching for and what he was doing, simply said that severe asceticism, denial, self-denial, is not the way to accomplish anything. On the other hand, if you're a lazy bum, you're not going to accomplish anything either. And so the strategy that seems to be appropriate for this is to adopt the middle way. Now, later, if you come up to me, I'll tell you what the real meaning of the middle way is, which is not what people normally think it is, which is to avoid extremes. But as a first approximation, the middle way is to live a life that is free of extremes. So this saved the Buddha. He regained his strength, and so he made a final push to find his answer. He sat down at the base of a tree, and he sat there for weeks. He had vowed that he would not move until he had found the answer to the problem of human suffering. And after weeks, there was, including many days and nights when he had serious doubts. There's a story about Mara, who is the god of illusion, and can be thought of as the equivalent of the devil, if you wish. And he came to the Buddha, and he tempted him with delights. He showed him a bevy of beautiful women, young maidens, and the Buddha remained unmoved. He showed him, threatened him with a horde of ogres, horribly beweaponed, and the Buddha remained unmoved. It's said in the legends that as they fired their flaming arrows at him, the flames of the arrows dispersed into rose petals. It's beautiful stuff. And who's to know whether this is all not true or not? But after all this time, on one morning, he looked up at the evening star, and he had awakened to the truth of human suffering. He had found his aid. And so Siddhartha then became, up until then, he was not. the Buddha translates to awakened one. And so on that morning, he had awakened. So, what did the Buddha discover? He discovered that suffering is inevitable. Suffering is inevitable at some level because life is problematic. It simply is. I mean, you go about, you may break your arm or your leg. You know, something causes you to suffer. It's magic. And that's just unavoidable. There is unavoidable suffering. A loved one dies, and you will suffer because that loss, that hole in your life that is yet to be filled. The problem is that human beings add to their suffering. And that's in part what he discovered. He discovered that people add to their suffering, to their anguish, to their frustration, and they do it in several ways. First of all, they do it by taking it personally. Why did this have to happen to me? Shake our fist at the sky. We get ourselves involved in self-recrimination. What did I do wrong? So that's the first thing that they do. The other way that they add to their suffering is by clinging or pushing away. So if they want something bad enough, or they have something that they want badly, they hold on to it very tightly. And that causes suffering because you're afraid that somebody's going to take it away. Or they push away something they don't want, which is another form of clinging. Because to cling, if I cling to something I want, I cling it to bring it, push it, pull it to me. But if I don't want it, I grab it and push it away as hard as I can. So those are both forms of clinging. So clinging is another cause of suffering. And the ultimate cause of suffering is ignorance. We just flat don't understand what we're looking at. We don't understand the nature of experience. And this is where most of our suffering comes from. One particular misunderstanding is that there's a me, that there is not to say that there's not someone standing here who's giving a talk, you know, his name is John, used to be a physicist, but isn't anymore because he didn't like it. Whatever that story is, that's just a story. And one of the major causes of suffering is that we buy into those stories, we create those stories, we constantly modify those stories so that we feel better about it. And they're not a story about anything or anymore. So it's just our ignorance that leads us to believe that there is an enduring person named John who is independent of anything that happens, anything that goes wrong with the computer or whether you like this talk or not. This is life as a whole, and everything is interconnected. So there are no independent anythings. There are no permanent anythings. And this is what the Buddha was able to see. That's why he had to meditate, so it's to actually penetrate all of these perceptual distortions and to see the truth of reality for what it was. So the other contribution the Buddha made, because many of the Hindu sages had found very similar truths. And what the Buddha did was he codified this. He created a path, and he recommended that people follow it. And that path includes what I just told you about the cause of suffering. It's called the Four Noble Truths. And then the last of the truths is that, by the way, if you want to be relatively free of suffering, then follow this path. And the path has these 8 recommendations. They're called things like right livelihood and right action, right speech, and so on. Right is an unfortunate translation to English because it doesn't have anything to do with right or wrong. It's really more like skillful, recommended, whatever. But The path in general is divided into three pieces. There's a piece that talks about how to lead a virtuous life, a life that's relatively free of friction with one's fellow human beings, how to develop concentration and keen powers of observation, because he wants you to discover this truth for yourself. He wants you to look at things and see them exactly as they are. And that's hard because we're beset with all sorts of perceptual distortions and biases. And then the last is to cultivate wisdom through the insight that's provided when we meditate, when we regard the world in a deep and penetrating way. So this was his remedy for suffering. It's more like his prescription. Buddha was considered, called by some the great physician, because he looked at human suffering and said, "You're suffering, you're ill. What can we do about that?" And so he provided a cause. He studied the problem until he saw the cause, and then provided a prescription for alleviating unnecessary pain, which is called dukkha. Now, this caught on, and it caught on quite solidly in India for a time. And then for whatever reason, India was not necessarily a Buddhist place anymore. But there is still really strong interest in Buddhism. So it migrated southward to Ceylon. My teacher's teacher was a monk from Sri Lanka, which is what Ceylon is called now. And it also migrated east across Asia into Southeast Asia. And something profound happened when it went to China. I'll talk about when it went to China and encountered Taoism and Confucianism. I'm confused about that, but both influenced Buddhism there. The teachings of Confucius resonated with the teachings of virtue that Buddhism brought with it, and the wisdom teachings from the Taoist hermits resonated very strongly with Buddhist wisdom. So I'll tell you more about that. And then from China, it made its way to Japan. It also went northward and found a home in Tibet. So let's talk about Taoism. So as I said, when Buddhism found its way into China, it found a welcoming home, as welcoming as a home full of hermits can be, but it found a home and found kinship in the wisdom tradition of the Tao. Taoist hermits, sages, through their own meditative techniques, discovered that there is a single reality that is really untouched by social convention or by the appearances that we have of it. And it is the natural order of things. That's the way they think about it. They call that reality the Tao, which translates to the way. So the Tao transcends all opposites. This is where the idea of non-duality enters the picture very strongly, is that the Tao transcends all opposites. Just look into your mind sometime and you'll realize that in order for you to think anything, you have to create opposites. As soon as you think of an idea, you automatically think of its opposite. Why? Because it allows you to contrast that idea of something with something that is not, or that is not what you're considering at the time. And so the mind, everything the mind does rationally shatters our experience into fragments that are, it's just a bewildering array of opposite concepts. These opposite concepts aren't bad. In a relative sense, it allows us to appreciate things that we wouldn't appreciate otherwise. So you can't appreciate light without darkness. You can't appreciate peace without war. If you didn't have war, you might be happy, but you wouldn't have such a strong contrast between war and peace that would allow you to really find joy in the peaceful times that you have. And these opposites in the Taoist tradition are what makes the world move. It's not a contest between opposites. It's that opposites move things one way and move things back the other way. And this gives a dynamic motion to everything. This is the natural order. And it's represented in this symbol you see down below that I'm sure you've seen many times. You might even have a t-shirt with the symbol on it. And it's the yin yang symbol. Yin is the feminine, is sort of generally called the feminine principle, the feminine force. And yang is the masculine force. And the cosmology of Taoism and Chinese medicine and all sorts of cultural things are divided into yin. If you go on a Chinese, if you consult Chinese medicine for your diet, then there will be yin things that you eat and yang things that you eat. So the interesting thing, and the reason I bring up the Tao, is that when we look at parallels between science and mysticism, we see the Tao in them. So here's one of the most interesting things about the Taoist way of living, and you will be tested on this. So the essence of Taoism is called Wu Wei, which it translates to non-doing. Okay, and here's Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao Te Ching, from chapter 38, I believe. And he says, in the pursuit of learning, every day something is acquired. In the pursuit of Tao, every day something is dropped. Less and less is done until non-action is achieved. When nothing is done, nothing is left undone. The world is ruled by letting things take their course. It cannot be ruled by interfering. So that's the essence of the way. And as I said, there will be a quiz. So let's look at Buddhism as a philosophy, because now we're going to transition into the comparison with science. So interestingly, Aldous Huxley wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy. He became very interested in commonality among these wisdom traditions. And I think not by accident. There was kind of a theosophist movement at the time in the early part of the 20th century. And I think that caught on. People became interested in all these mystic traditions. They didn't really know how to relate. So Huxley wrote a book called A Perennial Philosophy, in which he said that this kind of wisdom can be seen the world over, and it comes up all the time. And it's basically this idea that there is a deeper reality in which all things are one. So Buddhism, many of these are based on non-duality. Why non-duality? Because it's duality that makes you see the multiplicity of things, which is a useful skill, but it also prevents you from seeing the oneness of it, because your mind is filled with boundaries, this, not that. So all of these traditions of wisdom are based on non-dual truth and point to the direct realization of that oneness experience. Now, its relevance to psychology and science comes from this particular perspective, as well as the value placed on direct observation, direct experience. So here's where we kind of move into the secular side of Buddhism. I would argue that it sort of was secular from the beginning, but there are people that would argue with me. I don't want to disrespect that. There are human concerns about life, and they touch on both the sacred and the secular, which is why we're here. That's what this forum is all about. We have a secular life and we have a sacred life. And these wisdom traditions would argue that it's all the same. It's all one thing. So what does Buddhism offer our secular side? And in particular, what does it offer to science? So here's a quote from the Buddha that may surprise some people. It comes from something called the Kalama Sutra, in which the Buddha visited this village, this community of people, who were constantly, I think they were on a crossroads or something, they're constantly beset by sages and wise men. And they just accosted them constantly, and they became very confused. And they started asking the Buddha all sorts of questions, about what is it that you teach, and why do you teach something different than this guy, and what happens when the next guy comes in? And he said this. He said, "Do not go upon what has been acquired by repeated hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon what is in scripture. When you know yourselves, these things are good. These things are not blamable. These things are praised by the wise. Undertaken and observed, these things lead to benefit and happiness. Then enter on and abide in." So look for yourself. So I have to make give you a short tour of Zen Buddhism, because Zen Buddhism is a branch of Buddhism that relies very strongly on direct experience. I was told once by my teacher, who was making fun of Zen teachers, that he had been told by one of his students, he said, "I used to be a Zen student, and now, that I'm your students, I get explanations. It's wonderful." Whereas what a Zen teacher typically does is he sits you on a cushion and says, "Shut up, sit down, shut up, and pay attention." That's pretty much all you get. Now, that's me coming from another tradition. In truth, Zen is Buddhism, and there are many, many sutras that are taught in Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. But the value of direct experiences is very high. It's very highly valued in Zen Buddhism. And there's a series of pictures in a model called the Zen ox herding picture that I'm just going to run through briefly, that shows you how the spiritual journey in Buddhism sort of canonically goes. And so it starts out with searching for the ox. I'll just read this one. For each one of these beautiful pictures that were painted maybe 100 years ago by a Japanese, someone who's considered a Japanese treasure. This poem says, "Vigorously cutting a path through the brambles, you search for the ox. Wide rivers, eternal mountains, the path seems endless. With strength depleted and mind exhausted, you cannot find it. There is only the gentle rustle of maple leaves and the cicada's evening song." What is this? This is that sense that we have sometimes, that there is something else. There is something perhaps bigger, something that may be missing from our lives, and we go looking for it. So I'm not going to read these, but I'm just going to show you the pictures. You can find these poems. So there's finding traces of the ox. So you see his footprints. You begin to look into certain things. Maybe you pick up a book that catches your imagination about spirituality, and you begin to see something there. You're not sure what it is. Then they're seeing the ox. Notice what part of the ox we're seeing. And that's deliberate because we always get some kind of, funny notions about what the ox is. What is this thing that we're searching for? Whether we're searching for it through Christianity or through Buddhism. Then there's catching the ox, and then you have something on your hands, because it just doesn't want to be caught. It's just, I'll read the poem. It says, "Through extraordinary effort, you seize the ox. Still, its will is forceful and its body spirited. Sometimes it runs high into the mountains. Other times it disappears into the mist." This is the experience people will find they have when they are on a path of faith or on a different kind of path. There's taming the ox. Now we've got hold of it. It's beginning to gentle. And then this is the beautiful part. There comes a point where everything just kind of lines up. This is riding the ox home. If you have another tradition of faith, this will be the point where you feel comfortable in your community, you feel comfortable with the teachings, it all seems right. And then you realize that even this path is just a story. It's just a story. If we take that story about the path to be real, then we get stuck on it. So if you meet people in Christianity, Islam, other traditions that are stuck in their beliefs, that's what happens. They take the belief to be real. They take the map for the territory. And in this phase of the journey, we're beginning to see through that. And then what happens at the end? Both ox and ox herder disappear. There is nothing but the one reality. What else can there be? So, one reason I'm bringing this up is that I'm going to claim that science is very much like searching for the ox. You can probably see the parallels if you've beaten your head on research. There's a difference. We go for quantitative understanding if we possibly can through mathematics, but we also use description. We can't talk to our colleagues if we only use mathematics. There are nuances that we have to be able to communicate. And so the descriptions are necessarily poetic as well as mathematical. So that's the point I wanted to make, is that there are two basic approaches to knowledge that seem as at odds, but they're not really. Science aims for knowledge that's quantifiable and testable. And there are certain necessary conditions for that. The language of science is mathematics for a reason, and it deals with logic as a way of making inferences that it feels confident will stick. Other areas of human knowledge, you seek intuition. So intuition is something that you know, not cognitively, but you know. So if I ask you all to raise your hand, I will ask you to raise your hand. Now close your eyes, keep your hands raised, and just wave it about. Do you know that your hand is raised? Do you have to think about it? Do you have to say to yourself, my hand is raised, oh my God, my hand is raised? You don't. You have an intuitive understanding of what that feels like. Now, you'll come back and say, oh, well, there's nerves, all sorts of nerve pathways and feedback mechanisms that give us a sense of what they call proprioception. But that is something that you know. That is an intuitive understanding. So what's the science of Buddhism? Science of Buddhism derives ultimately from these insights that come from direct observation of conscious experience. It's a way of using the mind as an instrument to investigate reality. And this is something that people have been doing for thousands of years. And because of that, Buddhism is able to offer things to psychology that wouldn't be available otherwise. Do any of you know who Alan Watts is? In the 60s, he wrote, and 70s and so on. He wrote some wonderful books. His book that was actually called Psychology East and West became not only a bestseller, but it actually brought people from the West into these mystical traditions. And he said, if we look deeply into such ways of life as Buddhism, we do not find either philosophy or religion as these are understood in the West. We find something more nearly resembling psychotherapy. So there are psychotherapeutic uses of Buddhism. You would have to be in a cave if you haven't heard about mindfulness as a way of making your life better. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, kind of depends on what you do with it. But its health benefits and psychological benefits have been clinically verified. And nearly every major hospital has some kind of clinical program that uses mindfulness as it was originally intended for chronic pain, but also to help control depression, grief, anxiety, hypertension, to contribute to your immune health, because when you don't feel so stressed all the time, your immune system works better, and addiction and obsession. But Buddhism is also a kind of cognitive therapy, because the things that Buddhists discovered that made their lives better can make your life better. These truths about suffering and its cause can contribute to your reduction in suffering. And so this broader perspective helps. And some of the points that are available in this perspective are that self-concepts are no more than stories and ideas. They are no more than stories and ideas. I will say that as often as you would like me to. When you go to a psychologist, what they often try to do is to reframe your problem so that it fits your sense of who you would like to be. They can only do that because you started with a story to begin with. So to realize that is important, and it can have cognitive therapeutic benefits. It helps to know that if you are lonely or you feel abandoned, you can never be abandoned. You are life itself. How can you be abandoned? Opinions and beliefs are neither absolutely right or absolutely wrong. How many of you have strong opinions? All right, I have strong opinions. Do I believe them? Sometimes. Would I fight over them? No, because they're just opinions. And this one is really important. Many of us go to a therapist because we suffer from difficult emotions, uncontrolled anger, anxiety, depression. This is something that is helpful to know. Feelings and emotions, and meditators, and if you meditate, you can discover this yourself. Feelings and emotions are natural phenomena. They're not you. They're natural phenomena with their own natural history and are not personal. They're not yours. My anger is not my anger. It's just anger. It gets triggered somehow. It rises up, and if I don't poke at it, it will fall away. So difficult emotions pass away on their own. These are things that come from Buddhism that are helpful. Now, what about Buddhism and neuroscience? This is a really interesting thing to look at. I had to actually watch a couple of panel discussions to get this. It has two distinct relationships to neuroscience. Buddhist meditators can be subjects. So neuroscientists love to hook you up to things, image your brain, and they do that with meditators. They've been doing it for years. So in the first instance, they're using meditators as guinea pigs. They're not asking them. They're just hooking them up to wires. And in the second instance, where Buddhists could be contributors to the study of consciousness itself, which is a big topic these days. Just go anywhere. And scientists as well. They're just enormously intrigued with where consciousness comes from. If you sometimes ask a neuroscientist where consciousness comes from, he says, oh, it's an emergent property of the brain. Thanks a lot. Like, I didn't know that. But really, where is consciousness from? There are people who doubt whether the brain is entirely responsible or not. And just give you a taste of that. You are sitting there listening to me, and I am speaking to you. And your response to me is part of my consciousness. And my response, and so on. So we have the same consciousness at this point in time. So is it mine? Is it just my brain? So, as I said, one of the ways in which neuroscience relates to Buddhism is by studying meditators. They found that meditators, particularly advanced ones, show increases in cortical thickness, or parts of the brain that get bigger. Hopefully that's a good thing. It's increased prefrontal lobe activity. We know that prefrontal lobe is more or less, they sort of say it's the seat of inhibition, but really it's what allows us to have mental stability. Without our prefrontal lobe, we would not have a stable mental experience. It would just be all over the place. Increases in alpha and theta brain waves supposedly correlate with a sense of relaxation and mental stability. And these gamma band oscillations, which I don't know anything about, are correlated with mental clarity. Now, neuroscience and consciousness, they don't care. This is very early stages of neural neurologists looking into consciousness, they're looking for what they call correlates of consciousness. So if I knock you out with a hammer and you pass out, do I still get the same image on my fMRI? Does that mean that I've discovered the root of consciousness? Thank you for taking care of me. I really do appreciate it. No, it's wonderful. See, we're all part of this thing. I couldn't do this without you. So they're looking for what they call neurological signatures of consciousness in the brain, and hopefully that correlate with certain mental states. They do not ask Buddhist meditators or any other meditators about their introspective experience of consciousness, except on podcasts. That which is really hilarious. So you tune in this podcast and you've got a neurologist sitting here, you've got a meditator or a guru sitting here, and they talk back and forth about consciousness. Okay, but at the moment they don't believe it's that introspective experience is in any sense true. So it's their problem. Now we'll finish with Buddhism and physics. We can think of them as very separate because of this difference in the way investigations are conducted. Physics relies on objective measurements rather than subjective measurements. Good thing. Physics prefers quantitative mathematical descriptions over poetic descriptions. We don't usually write a poem about the electron, the quantum electric field, but we could. And as people begin to try and understand whatever philosophy or intuition should be behind that, they become more and more poetic, as you'll see. There's a philosophical impasse, which is not new in modern physics, that have led physicists to Eastern philosophy, and here's one of them. So this is Niels Bohr, you've heard of him. In 1947, he was knighted. He was just sitting there minding his own business, and the Danish king came along and said, "I'm going to knight you." He said, "Well, what do I have to do?" And he said, "Well, you have to come up with a coat of arms. You're a knight now." So he did. The reason there are elephants, if you can see them on this coat of arms, is because this was called the Order of the Elephant. I don't know why. He probably didn't either. But notice what's in the center of that coat of arms. Is the Taoist symbol of yin and yang. And as he explained it, it's all about, is it an electron a particle or is it a wave? Yes. That's Taoism. That's non-duality. Here's another famous person. Quantum mechanics, as you know, is a formidable philosophical challenge. It's not a calculational challenge. It's not a scientific challenge. We know how to do quantum mechanics. We don't know what we're actually doing or what it is we're looking at. And so Feynman famously said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics. Okay, and that echoes Lao Tzu, who said, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. I'm not making this up. Now, one last thing we're going to talk about is entanglement. The Buddha thought about this philosophically many, many years ago. And my teacher would summarize that as what he considers to be a simple fact. Everything causes everything. Everything causes everything. That's why there's not an independent self. Yes, there's a self. There's somebody that you see talking to you here, but not an independent self. There's not an impermanent self because everything's causing everything else. I can't avoid change. And that means that my stories about myself are just stories. So all the perennial philosophies recognize the oneness of ultimate reality. And the correlate of that is that nothing is truly isolated. And this leads to these are Buddhist principles called the 3 marks of existence, that everything is selfless. Not only you are selfless, but everything is selfless. This computer is selfless. We see it as a computer. We call it a computer. We label it a computer. If I look deeply, I'll see circuits. If I look more deeply still, I'll see electrons whizzing around. If I keep going, who knows what I'll find. So everything is selfless, everything is impermanent. These are all marks that are essentially different sides, if you had a three-sided coin, of the same coin. So everything is selfless and permanent and interdependent. Everything causes everything. So those resonate with the principle of quantum entanglement. When two particles are prepared in a certain way, then they share the same wave function. At least that's how we think of it. We don't really know that that's true, but that's the explanation we have. Because if you prepare them in a certain way, and then you separate them by a large distance, they don't know how far you can separate them to this day, and you conduct a measurement on one of them, the other one will reflect that measurement. So the famous one is that either a photon or a neutron or an electron, they have something called a quantum number called spin. It's not really spinning, but we'll just call it spin. And there can be a spin up and a spin down. These particles are fermions. They can't have the same state. And so if one of them is spin up, the other one has to be spin down. Now, prepare them. Okay, you don't know what they are. They're a superposition, because in quantum mechanics, we know that we don't know what anything is until we measure it. And then it becomes something, because the state of the whatever it is at that time is a probability. It's not a fact. But then when we measure it, it becomes a fact. Particle is a wave, probability wave, until it becomes a particle. When it becomes a particle, when you measure it, put it in a cloud chamber or something like that. Particle, an accelerator. And so this is an amazing mystery, and people can't get their heads around it. They feel like Einstein couldn't get his head around it. Now, Einstein had a very big head, and so we believe that he could get his head around it. He just wasn't satisfied. And so there have been experiments to show that this is a fact. Not only will, when you measure this photon spin up, will this one be spin down? But the way in which you measure it will determine the likelihood of it being spin up or spin down when you look at it hard. And you can set up an experiment where you don't know which you're going to measure until a coin is randomly flipped. And then you measure it, and if you measure this as spin up, this one is spin down. If you measured it as a spin down, this one is spin up. Nobody knows what's happening. There are theories about that, and a couple of them actually are starting to tend towards the idea that there is one wave function for everything. There is one wave function for everything. And that's consistent with what's called the many worlds interpretation of physics. So that's about all I can stand. I am not sure how all of you feel, but I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity